I've actually heard that somebody has developed a artificial nose to identify aromas objectively. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical about this sort of development because it's misunderstanding what's happening when we actually perceive wine, because we're not measuring devices, and an artificial nose is a measuring device. So what you've got there is you've got the effectively, our olfactory epithelium is acting at the sensory level. It's detecting signals, but the actual perception of smell and flavor more broadly happens much further down in a sort of black box of, higher order processing, that all those receptor level signals then get combined and made sense of, so you're getting all this information in. We're extracting from all this information out there the bits that are useful to us. And I think that whole process is really interesting. And I think an artificial nose that gives you a chemical readout of what's there is lacking in all that higher order processing, the thing that makes sense out of the signal. So even if you could spot, the different chemicals that are present in wine, so what? What does that mean? Does that tell you anything about wine quality? I don't think it does.
Fascinating people with stories to share, fabulous wines and the best local foods to accompany them, and beautiful places to discover and visit. All of this and more on Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast. Join me for a new episode every Tuesday. Welcome to Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on Italian Wine Podcast. Today we travel to London to meet my guest, Jamie Goode, wine writer, broadcaster, communicator. Many thanks for being our guest today, Jamie. How are you?
Very well, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty wild in London. I'm in Devon right now, and we're going through a massive storm.
Yeah, it's not so bad here. It's a bit damp and grey, but otherwise quite pleasant.
Okay, good. It's been damp and grey for most of January, but hopefully better days are on the way. Jamie, you're quite prolific as a wine journalist with a weekly wine column in the Sunday Express. You have your wine blog and wine website, wineanorak.com. You've written a number of award-winning books, notably I Taste Red, Authentic Wine, which explores natural and sustainable winemaking, and Wine Science, which looks at the application of science in winemaking. Now you're involved in Wine Masters TV, which is an exciting project. So first of all, tell us a little bit about your own background. When and how did you come to be involved in the world of wine?
Well, I was a bit of a gatecrasher. In my mid-20s, a circle of friends that I was involved with, one of the members had a wine hobby and started sharing interesting bottles with us. And as a result, my interest was piqued. And I just started becoming a wine geek. And that process was accelerated by the arrival of the internet, because I was working in a job as a science editor. We had broadband internet kind of earlier than most. It was an academic sort of environment. And I discovered all these bulletin boards. So these are, places where people would gather to discuss, wine. And one of the really good things about the early days of the internet was that it gave an opportunity for like-minded people to gather around a subject and connect in a meaningful way. And that really jump-started my education in wine. And I started a hobby website, Wine Anorak, in around 1997. I registered a domain name in 99, so I guess that's the official start of the website. And it got some traction. And, I was quite confident of my knowledge, even though it probably wasn't as deep as I thought it was. And I started pitching ideas to magazines, and suddenly I started getting paid to write about wine. And then, that kind of grew and grew. And then eventually in 2008, I had enough work to kick the day job. So I stopped being a science editor, started being a full-time wine writer. And it's really progressed from there. It's been very interesting. It's a sort of existence that's hard to define. I do all sorts of different work, but it's really enjoyable.
Wow, that's really interesting. And interesting, actually, as you say, to go back to those early days of the internet when it was quite exciting. I remember things like CompuServe and, ways of connecting when emails really hadn't even started yet. And it was a very exciting way of communicating because it was really difficult prior to that to find communities of whatever subject.
Yeah.
But Jamie, you hold a PhD in plant biology, is that right?
Yes, that's correct, yeah. So I finished university and wanted to hang around another 3 years. So I did a PhD, which was really fun. But yeah, it wasn't going to lead to an academic career. So
Okay. So I was just wondering because, was Vitis vinifera an interesting plant to you in those days?
no, this is before I was a wine drinker. So, it really wasn't on the radar at all. This was looking at the development of the first stage of mosses, which is called the protonemal stage, and doing some cell biology, microscopy, all that sort of thing. So it really wasn't related to wine at all. But I think what it did, and then working for 15 years as a science editor after that gave me a sort of like a scientific literacy, a fluency in science that really helped when it came to viticulture and winemaking.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, a recurring theme in all your work is a curiosity about the science of wine and winemaking. And I guess it's easy to see where that came from, given your interest and your professional work as a science editor. The production of wine touches almost all the natural sciences, doesn't it? Biology, chemistry, physics. I guess even if you're a biodynamic producer, even astrophysics. Tell me about your main interests in wine and science.
Well, when I came to the wine world, I realized that people were using science and scientific terms all the time, sometimes without really understanding them. So my interest was kind of like digging deeper. What is it that makes one wine really interesting and another wine merely very ordinary? Obviously in a vineyard, what a lot of stuff that's going on in a vineyard. And I think for a long time, the wine world labored with this false idea that the soil was merely a medium for growing vines, and that basically you could give all our attention to the crop plant. And I think that's been shown not to be the case by a lot of the work that's been going on over the last few years, especially in the regenerative field. So my interest really closing the loop. So starting off with the grapevine, the vineyard as an agro ecosystem, how the interactions in that vineyard situation then translate into a certain level of grape quality and character. Then obviously the microbiological transformation of grape juice into wine. And then, following on from that, the whole notion of the perception of wine, the human response to wine, because, when we taste, we're not measuring devices. There's a lot of very interesting psychology going on when it comes to tasting wine and neuroscience and all this stuff. So you've got this kind of loop. And I think science provides insights at all these different levels.
That's fascinating as well, especially bringing in the human element. As you say, we taste wine very subjectively, and yet we try to put it in words in a way that's quite analytic and precise when it's actually very imprecise. I've actually heard that somebody has developed a artificial nose to identify aromas objectively. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical about this sort of development because it's misunderstanding what's happening when we actually perceive wine, because we're not measuring devices, and an artificial nose is a measuring device. So what you've got there is you've got effectively, our olfactory epithelium is acting at the sensory level. It's detecting signals, but the actual perception of smell and flavor more broadly happens much further down in a sort of black box of, higher order processing, that all those receptor level signals then get combined and made sense of, so you're getting all this information in, we're extracting from all this information out there the bits that are useful to us. And so, for instance, if you walk down a busy market, you might say, oh, I smell coffee. Well, actually what coffee is a collection of maybe 700 or 800 different odorants co-occurred together that we learn to recognize as coffee. And we can recognize now a small subset of those as coffees. And this sense of olfactory objecthood, I think, is really interesting. The idea that in this crazy mix of aromas that you're experiencing, you can immediately pick out coffee, even though there's so many different molecules with odorant activity present in that marketplace. You're able to pick out a subset immediately and recognize them as coffee. And so you can think about wine. When we recognize wine, the first thing we smell wine, we go, oh, that's wine. And then we dig a little deeper and we try and dissect out, that the brain has done this brilliant job of combining all those signals into a single, flavor, and that we understand and recognize. And then we're trying to break them apart and trying to dissect out the various elements in wine as professionals who say, does this have any cherry in it? Does it have leather in it? Does it have spice? All these things. And I think that whole process is really interesting. And I think an artificial nose that gives you a chemical readout of what's there is lacking in all that higher order processing, the thing that makes sense out of the signal. So even if you could spot, the different chemicals that are present in wine, so what? What does that mean? Does that tell you anything about wine quality? I don't think it does.
Yeah, and it strips the soul out of wine as well, because we all have our own sensory memories. People that have never tasted coffee aren't going to recognize it. And the same with our vocabulary for wine.
Yeah, and also we learn, this is why as children, it takes a long time to go from a baby to an adult. It's years and years and years, because in that period we're learning about the world around us and learning how to understand it in terms of objects and how these objects operate with each other. And so you go from a baby, effectively it's a bit like machine learning and AI. It's like you've got this big data set out there, which is the world, and you're trying to understand it, and it takes years for us to understand how the world works, for us to be able to navigate it properly as an adult. So I think this is really interesting.
Yeah, actually, we've got a 3-year-old grandson, and we're watching him develop and his language develop, by the day, which is really, really fascinating. Now, Jamie, in your new winemasters.tv series, you take, I would say, a playful yet analytic approach to wine to explore topics that can be looked at scientifically. It looks like you had a lot of fun making it, and it's very entertaining and also very informative. Tell us about the series. Tell us about the production team, how it came about. I mean, you play the guitar a lot. It's a fun way to impart serious knowledge.
Well, yeah, I first came across the director, the guy behind Wine Masters TV, a couple of years ago. He's called Klaas de Jong, and Dutch guy, and he's made movies in the past, and before that he managed bands, and he's really the person responsible for all this. I came to do a talking head section. I went to film for a day with him, and he must have thought that I was reasonable and suggested this idea of doing a series on science of wine. And, if you think about doing a TV series in the science of wine, most people would say this is a stupid idea because it sounds very boring and it's not going to make good television. And that's where Klaas and Diederik and Wouter, the two camera sound guys, that's where they managed to come up with an idea of doing these episodes, looking at different aspects, of the science of wine, asking a question each time and making it kind of dynamic, fun, quite playful, at times a little bit daft. But something that people who weren't necessarily that interested in wine could watch without being bored stupid. And I was fully into this. I think this is a great idea. And then Klaas said, well, why don't you bring your guitar? So I said, what, my acoustic? He said, no, you're electric. So I brought my electric guitar along. And they decided that it would be good to have musical segments in the show. So each one has got a special musical segment. And I was basically told to sit down and write something, about a minute long. And so we did this on set. So I'd sit down with the guitar, plug it into a tiny little amplifier. That's part of the thing, was finding a little battery-powered amplifier that's very portable.
Yeah, so you could play in vineyards or
Yeah.
In laboratories or wherever.
Yeah, and the idea was I sat down and started playing, and after a few minutes I got something that I liked, and I said to the guys, I've got the piece of music. So then we played it, and then when I got home I recorded it properly, but I also recorded the other musical segments and the music for the show itself, which for me is tremendous fun because I like playing guitar, and this gave me a reason to allot some time to guitar playing, which was really good. And the format is quite fast-paced. There's not too many talking heads. A lot of stuff is done in really nice settings. The lighting that they've got is amazing. And usually with 2 to 3 cameras filming at the same time, so that you've got some dynamism there. And there's quite a lot of walking shots as well. You're talking, you're walking towards the camera. And there's driving shots as well, which we start off with each one where I talk to the camera that's bolted on the side of the door of the van. Yeah, this is all quite fun. And each episode we pick a scientist usually and a winemaker, and they're, part of the story as well. It's all made up on the fly. There's no script. We have to improvise and make it up. And they're very good. They're very honest. They're Dutch. If I do a take and it's not very good, I kind of know it isn't. But they'll say immediately, that's rubbish. We'll do it again, And so it's quite intense. It's hard work filming. It takes about 2.5 days to film a 30-minute episode, but it's really great when you see what these guys have done at the end, putting it all together. I'm really impressed, and it's been just a really nice thing to have done.
Well, you make it look very easy. It's not easy to just talk as you're walking up a row of vines or when you're driving, but I think it works really well. I watched episode 2, which asks the question, are ungrafted wines better than grafted wine? And I found this really fascinating because, as anybody involved in the world of wine knows, of this scourge of Phylloxera that ravaged the vineyards of Europe end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And, the world of wine changed forever. But you've actually really explored ungrafted vines that are being planted again, which I had no idea. I know there are, pre-Phylloxera vines dotted around Europe in particular areas where Phylloxera can't live. But this incredible project in Bordeaux of actually planting a vineyard with ungrafted vines was really fascinating. Tell us a little bit about your findings and your conclusions.
Well, obviously, there's quite a lot of ungrafted vines around the world. If you go to Chile, it's pretty much ungrafted. Phylloxera hasn't got there. Argentina has phylloxera, but it's got a lot of ungrafted vines there. South Australia has not had phylloxera, so South Australia has lots of ungrafted vines. So there are places around the world where there are a lot of ungrafted vines, but some regions have planted vines ungrafted, and then afterwards it's phylloxera's hit them. I mean, Marlborough in New Zealand initially was ungrafted, and in the 90s that got hit by phylloxera. Central Otago, most of the old vineyards there ungrafted. Ripon, for example, is still ungrafted. They have very good security measures to keep phylloxera out of the vineyards there. So in Europe, there's little pockets, but to actually plant ungrafted is tremendously risky. And I think one thing that stops phylloxera in its tracks is sandy soils. They don't like sandy soils. And also they don't like being flooded. So if you want to plant a vineyard that's ungrafted, there's 3 things you can do. One is you can plant it and pray. The second is you can plant it in sandier soils, and that's where phylloxera won't affect you. And the third is you can do things like, if you can, like the Centimillion property that we went to see, they had sort of sandyish soils, and in the winter they used a lot of water just to kind of flood the soils, just to make sure phylloxera doesn't establish there. But it is a complicated topic because, are the wines better? Well, I think that the ones I've tried sometimes have been different and sometimes have been better. And that really piques my interest again. It's something that's, such an interesting idea, this idea that not grafting can result in wines that are quite different. And one example would be Quinta de Noval's National Vineyard in the Douro. So Quinta de Noval's big vineyard. They've got a small block that is ungrafted called Nacional. These are not pre-phylloxera vines. They kind of regularly have to reap vines that have been lost, replanted. But the wines that come from the Nacional block are distinctly different from the wines that come from the rest of the estate. And we just don't know why. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about in Italy. Italy has a wealth of old vines, in many cases, Piedifranco or Pre-Phylloxera vines. I'm thinking of Etna, the Campi Flegrei near Naples, the steep terraces of Cinque Terre, lots of ungrafted vines there, Lombardy's Valtellina. What are your experiences with old vine Italian wines? Have you found similar richness and complexity that you found in that ungrafted claret, for example?
I think I'd have to say I haven't got enough experience, enough data points with old vine Italian wines. I've tasted some really cool things from Etna that's been really interesting. But generally speaking, I haven't done a thorough exploration of many of the regions that you've mentioned, and some of haven't been to at all, which is a terrible confession to make. But I think that there's a combination of factors. Once you've got old vines as opposed to young vines, then you've got old ungrafted vines as opposed to old grafted vines. It's such an interesting matrix of things going on there that it's really hard to pin down exactly what's responsible for the added quality. And one thing about old vineyards is that sometimes the old vineyards are there because they're good vineyards and they're still producing really interesting wines, so nobody's replanting them. And other vineyards that, it has to be a good vineyard for the people to tolerate the slightly reduced yields of many of these older vines, which often comes from missing vines and not necessarily from lower yields from the old vines that are still there. So there's a confounder there, which is that, are these old vineyards great because they're old, or are they just great sites and they'd be really good with younger vines? That's just that people have allowed these vines to grow old and tolerate the yield drop that accompanies that aging process. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, you're right. There's such a range of different factors involved in that. I mean, some of the vineyards in Etna, I think, are over 150 years. Some of the vines are over 150 years old that have almost survived because they had been abandoned. And this great renaissance in Etna wine has happened only in the last 25, 30 years. So it's not as if those vines had been appreciated and have been making great wines all that time. Um, Jamie, you also did an episode I really enjoyed. It was a real informative show on how an oak barrel is made. I mean, it's a fascinating story for a container that many drinkers completely take for granted. It's quite magical to see an oak barrel handcrafted, isn't it?
Yeah, now that was one of the documentary episodes from Wine Masters that I wasn't actually involved in that at all, but I fully agree. When you go to a tonnellery and you see the process by which a barrel is constructed out of staves, it's almost a mystery how they can produce something that's watertight from some sticks of wood. And that whole processing that goes on there is a real art, I think. And a barrel is a beautiful thing. I mean, I feel kind of guilty because a lot of the time I'm favoring wines that are being given alternative élevage, like in large format oak or in concrete or in terracotta or clay. I'm a real fan of those approaches. But barrels still have a very important role to play in wineries. And I think once you actually dig deep into the whole process and how effectively you're allowing an extrinsic flavor to come into the wine, if this was, barrels were invented today, we'd say you can't use them for wine because you're adding flavor to the wine. But they're given a pass because this is a traditional intervention. And so the impact of barrels on wine is really fascinating. The way they can build structure in red wines, they can contribute different flavor compounds, the way that different barrels allow different amounts of oxygen in that help to raise the wine in certain ways. And I think that's all super interesting. And also the effect of barrel size and the effect of the contact of the lees within the barrel, I think is a topic that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the barrels are an example of wine and technology. The fact that winemaking couldn't begin until vessels in terracotta, the art of making these large vessels out of clay, was perfected to enable, the grape must to be held and fermented. And barrels were another form of technology that's shaped what we think of wine today. When did the barrels come in? What was it, about the first century AD, or did the Romans get them from Gaul? I think that they came from Gaul because prior to that, the Romans, of course, were transporting wines in amphora,
Yeah.
which are very fragile.
Yeah. No, I think it must have been about then. And what's also interesting is the animal skins. I was in Rioja a few years ago. I was taken to an area because before barrels arrived in Rioja, it was made quite differently. So the whole region, as it is now, is a result of phylloxera because phylloxera hit Bordeaux. And basically, all the winemakers from Bordeaux headed down to Rioja and brought with them their winemaking technology, which revolved around using small oak, except that in Rioja, they used American oak rather than French oak. And it was fascinating that the way that winemaking transformed. But in the past, the wines would have made it quite a different way. So I went to an old traditional house where they'd have made the wine in the cellar in a concrete tank. And then to move the wine, they'd use pig skins. So animal skins used to be used quite often for transporting wine. And this pig skin could take, I think it was 80 or 90 liters of wine. And someone quite strong would pick it up once it was filled. That was a traditional way of moving wine around. And obviously this pig skin is still there, and it showed me how it's done. And I find that really interesting. I wonder if there's some natural people who have an interest in using animal skins for wine transport and aging.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting.
I was in Chile recently, visited a very, very natural winery near Casablanca, and I saw something that was completely new to me, which was the use of cow hides bolted or attached to a wooden frame. And then you see the shape of the cow hide was then what was used to ferment the wine in. So they made their red wines in these cow hides, which was very interesting.
Amazing, amazing. Yes, I remember those pig skins when we were researching a book on Spain many, many years ago. And the fact that you could grab the legs of the animal once it was filled and carry it on your back was fascinating. And of course, the botas, those personal drinking vessels, those leather pouches that you'd wear around your neck, although they've got plastic bladders now, would have been directly against the skin, adding its own particular flavor to the wine that must have been certainly quite unique and different to how we perceive wine today.
Yeah.
Jamie, wine is a beverage that's been enjoyed by humanity for what, 8,000, 10,000, 11,000 years, which has survived the rise and fall of great civilizations. Today, I think it's fair to say that at this moment, wine finds itself at something of a crossroads. It's facing a lot of challenges. I mean, climate change is one of the biggest challenges. How can science help wine growers to deal, with problems like excessive heat, excessive rain, drought, excessive sugar in the grapes before phenolic ripeness is reached, fungal diseases, so many things.
I think science has got quite a bit to contribute in terms of increasing the resiliency of vineyards. And this is one of the reasons that there's been a lot of interest in regenerative approaches, because if you farm in a way that's more regenerative, where you're looking at the soil health, you're looking at increasing biodiversity in the vineyard, there's very good evidence that those vineyards will be much more resilient in the face of some of the big challenges. One of the biggest challenges facing a lot of vineyards is drought. And the more soil organic material you have, the more the water is able to be held within the soil. You've got approaches like regenerative hydrology, which looks to shape the terrain in such a way that when the water does fall, it's kept on the land, and any excess that doesn't soak up into the soils is stored in dams and small water features. And that regenerative hydrology is becoming something of great interest. We've got agroforestry, where people are incorporating trees into agricultural landscapes, including vineyards. And this is one potential way, I think, of providing shade and also lowering temperatures, because trees transpire quite a lot. And as they transpire, the ambient temperature around the tree drops quite a bit. So if you're near a forest, the temperature there is much lower than in clear open land. So all these approaches together, when they're intelligently applied, I think can really increase the resiliency of vineyards in the face of climate chaos. And I think that's a super interesting area.
Yeah, I've been speaking to wine producers over many years, particularly Italian wine producers. Over the past years, I've been doing this show, and it's amazing how many now are taking whether organic or biodynamic approaches, and partly saying exactly that. Particularly in the past few years, when we've had really excessive temperatures, there have been a lot of problems with fungal diseases. This approach seems to really encourage vines to be more resilient and able to cope with some of these challenges. I know you've written a book, you co-wrote a book about this topic, Authentic Wines Towards Natural and Sustainable Winemaking. What does the term natural wine mean to you? And because of what we're just talking about, do you think this is more relevant today than it has been, and we'll see more of this?
Natural wine's an interesting topic. It's a big one as well. And I think it's been one of the most interesting things that's happened to the wine world in recent years. And I remember when I first got into wine, natural wine was a really tiny niche. It was just emerging. In France, there was, a steady presence of producers who were working more naturally, who met together and shared their information. But it wasn't mainstream. And I think it kind of hit the mainstream and became more talked about around 2010, 2011. We had the first natural wine fair in the UK, the Real Wine Fair. And that was, if I remember correctly, 2011. And that's really sparked a lot of interest in the UK. And, I think of it as an ecosystem of producers who share the same values in alliance with importers, wine bars, restaurants who kind of joined this whole natural cause. And it's something that it's a kind of banner that people have gathered under, that most of them don't actually call themselves natural. They just happen to be part of that ecosystem. They happen to be showing wines in the same sort of fairs, and they share the similar approach, which is they want to do as little as possible to their wines. I mean, they want sound wines, but they want to add as little as possible. And usually that means adding nothing other than a little bit of sulfur dioxide, perhaps, at some stage in the winemaking process, most commonly just before bottling. But the thing that's interesting is that the whole natural wine movement has done two things to the wine movement outside of natural. First of all, it's enraged a lot of people because they say, well, if you're using the term natural, you're implying the rest of us are unnatural. So there's been quite a lot of acrimony there. And, you go to countries where there's a lot of technological winemaking, like Australia, New Zealand, you talk about natural wine, and they kind of smirk a bit and then giggle. It's like, what are you on about? But actually, it's surprisingly large number of producers who are working in this sort of way, even if they wouldn't badge themselves as natural. And the other effect it's had on the rest of the wine world is made people think about the sort of additions they make. Are these, strictly necessary? For instance, wild fermentation, when I started getting into wine, was quite rare. People in New World countries, when they did a wild fermentation, they'd stick it in the bottle and everyone go, wow, this is a wild ferment. But since then, wild fermentation has become much more common. It's a really a very common thing to find that people aren't adding cultured yeasts. Obviously, the yeast companies go around trying to scare everybody. If you don't use cultured yeast, there's all the risks of things going wrong. But a lot of people, I think, are using wild fermentations who wouldn't even be close to calling themselves natural. So I think this has been a really interesting change in the winemaking landscape. And allied to the natural approach, there's been this move away from stainless steel and small oak towards large format oak, concrete, terracotta, Kvevri, tallias, tignacas, all these different ways of making wine. I think that's been really interesting. And you see these even in big company cellars now. They'll have a little experimental corner when maybe they've got a couple of non-blow eggs or something. So that's kind of a big change.
Yeah, you're right. I can certainly remember when something like biodynamics was considered, really kooky, and, things like the cow horn with the cow manure buried in the ground and then a tisane made. I remember speaking with Nicolas Joly many, many years ago. Actually, I met his mother before he was involved. And yeah, she was a real character. I remember her telling me when we were at Coulée de Sorrent that she said, thank goodness the wine is good. If not, I'd keep goats, because it was simply so hard. But people were really sneering at that approach, but nobody's sneering now, because large, chapoutier or big wine growers have embraced many of these topics and methods. Even, the planetary influence, gravity can lift an ocean. Why not have an effect on the liquid in a tank? So there is a much more greater acceptance. I think in Chianti Classico now, something like 60% of members of the consortia are certified organic, and a good many are biodynamic. Sicily has huge numbers, but even in an area like Friuli Venezia Giulia, which is quite wet, quite damp, there are a lot of organic and biodynamic producers working in a more low intervention way. So I think you're right. The world of wine has learned and is benefiting from this. And I think the wines are more interesting as well, don't you? To have these different containers. I think amphora has been a really fascinating development. Again, returning to wine as it was made thousands and thousands of years ago, but now really relevant to modern tastes, modern consumers.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think it's such an interesting wine world now. You were talking earlier, you say a wine is going through this sort of existential crisis. I think to some extent this is a little bit overblown. Yes, because it is a difficult time at the moment to sell wine. That's definitely the case. But a lot of that might just be down to affordability and the cost of living crisis, and the fact that things have got a lot more expensive recently and pretty much across the board. But what we're seeing, I think, is two trends. One, we've seen a trend of decreasing consumption in the traditional wine producing countries because they were drinking so much before. And that's going to come down to like Portugal and Italy and France. People were drinking heroic levels of wine. Of course, that's going to fall. It's a changing world. So on one level, there's a reduced demand because I would say that consumption has normalized a little bit. Whereas in other countries, people have discovered wine over the last 30 years. For instance, the UK, the wine consumption has gone up massively. Normal people didn't used to drink wine, and now wine is drunk by everybody. And you've got new countries where the wine industry has grown and developed, and that's fantastic. Look at any of the New World countries. You go to Canada, see that Canada now makes a lot of wine that it didn't make 30 years ago. Australia and New Zealand, they've kind of grown in terms of the interesting side of the wine industry. I think that the more bulk or the beverage alcohol side of the industry is in trouble. Again, that's because people aren't looking to drink quite as much, and the global wine market overall is in oversupply. But once you dig below the headline levels, there's a lot of good success stories for the people who are making wines that are a little bit more interesting, that have a bit more character to them. And this is one example of this. We're seeing this just thriving, whatever you want to call it, natural low intervention wine scene that has grown considerably over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think at the same time, we were at a risk of the wine world becoming ever smaller with grape varieties becoming brands, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir. And there's a lot more interest now, particularly in Italy, where I do a lot of work in this wealth of native grape varieties, but also from Portugal, from other countries. But I guess, Jamie, one of the existential threats to wine is the messages of wine and health that have been coming out from the WHO, from in the US, where there are going to be health warnings on the backs of labels. And there's a perception that wine is, we're almost reaching a neo-prohibition.
Yeah, this is a major concern. I think it was back in 2016. So 10 years ago, I was at the Australian Wine Technical Conference in Adelaide, and I did two talks, but one talk I was given the title of, which was the social license of wine. And I talked about this at great length, and wrote about this afterwards. And even 10 years ago, I was very concerned about the fact that, wine's social license is something we shouldn't take for granted. And now you've got this push from WHO, which I think is the message that they are communicating, I think isn't right. Because what they like to say is there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. Whereas the science has shown for years and years, every study that's done has shown this J-shaped curve when you plot consumption against mortality. So teetotalers, even if you factor out the sick teetotalers, so you take teetotalers, people who've never drunk rather than people who did drink and then stopped drinking as a baseline group, that their risk of mortality is higher than moderate drinkers. And then as you get down to the bottom, the nadir of the curve, it starts going up again. And then as you drink more, then your risk of death goes up after a certain point in consumption. And backing up that is the studies, the intervention studies they've done, short-term ones, where they've shown that looking at people who are split into groups, and some are drinking some wine, some aren't drinking any wine, they look at their blood, for instance, they do blood work, and they'll see that the good lipoproteins go up in the wine drinkers. And so there's a potentially, a causal explanation for why cardiovascular disease is mitigated to some extent by consumption of wine. So there's all this mechanistic work that kind of backs up the big, large cohort studies. It's just that people have, in public health, they kind of feel they've won the war with tobacco. So they want to make alcohol the new tobacco because they need, someone to keep funding them. And there's lots of these neo-prohibitionists who quite rightly don't like the social damage that alcohol abuse causes. But what they're doing is they're targeting moderate use of alcohol and trying to, to tell people that this is really bad, when actually the moderate use of alcohol is actually health-giving, and it's also indefinable social benefits. We share wine with each other, we open up more, we have these social interactions that are incredibly valuable and hard to quantify. So I think that this is something we should be very concerned about. I think the public health bodies who are effectively sending out false messages, those messages need to be countered. I think that too often the wine trade is quick to kind of seem like it's caring about public health by just accepting what bodies like WHO say, and I don't think that's right. And I think these limits, the guideline limits, are woefully low and aren't backed by evidence. I think this is a big problem for wine.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. And as you say, these health warnings pay no attention to the role that wine has played culturally and socially, for thousands of years, and frankly, in making life better for many people. As just a brief question, as a scientist, do you think that there will ever be a non-alcoholic wine that is drinkable?
I'm quite doubtful about that. I think there could be some very interesting drinks that you could make that aren't alcoholic, but de-alcoholizing wine does so much to the wine that you can't get it back. You can't recover. You can't recover it to something that actually tastes quite nice or tastes like wine.
Yeah, I've certainly not sampled any, not that I've sampled a great many, but yeah, we'll see. That's certainly something we're going to see more and more of, I guess. Finally, in spite of all the challenges we've discussed, do you feel positive about wine and the future of wine?
I think once you segment the industry, there's certain segments of the wine industry I'm very positive about. I feel great concern for the the bottom end, the sort of beverage alcohol, the cheapest wines, where wine is just a commodity. I think that's an area that I think is in some trouble. Maybe that will recover as people start pulling out vineyards and the balance between consumption and production is made. I don't know, but at the moment, I think the bits about interesting wines, the interesting places where wine is made, the people who make wine, people who sell wine, I'm very encouraged and I'm very hopeful because I think it's a beautiful community of skilled and dedicated individuals, and I love being part of it.
Good, yeah, me too. Well, Jamie, it's been a real pleasure talking to you this morning. Wine Masters TV, tell us, are these programs available now and how can our listeners tune in?
So it will depend a bit which country you're in, but they're now on the major streaming services. So where I am in the UK, you can get them on Amazon Prime and Apple TV. And I think there's quite a few countries now where they are available, but I'm not exactly sure of which streaming services carry them.
What about in the US?
In the US, I'm sure they are. There's one major one that's got them, but I don't know what it is. And it's very hard to check because if you try and log into these streaming services from the UK, they won't let you in because you're not, you're from the wrong market. So unless you've got a VPN, which I don't have, you can't see what the Americans are seeing.
Okay, well, I urge our listeners, wherever you are, to look out for winemasters.tv. As Jamie just said, it could be on a range of different streaming services wherever you are. It's exciting. It's a different, entertaining way to learn and expand your wine knowledge. I really loved what I watched, Jamie, and I'm sure our listeners will too. Jamie, thanks so much for being our guest today. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and it'd be nice to share a glass of wine sometime soon.
Yes, indeed. And I hope you don't get blown away by the storms.
No, it seems to have calmed down just a bit. Now the tide's turned, so hopefully we're over the worst. Thank you, Jamie, and have a great day.
Thank you.
We hope today's episode of Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast has transported you to somewhere special. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your pods. Likewise, you can visit us at ItalianWinePodcast.com. Until next time, chin chin.